What if the real story of Godzilla x Kong, the new empire, was never about who was stronger, but about two monsters who had spent their entire lives alone, finally discovering that strength means something different when you have someone to protect? At first glance, that question almost seems ridiculous. This is a movie where a gigantic ape wears a mechanical arm, a radioactive dinosaur turns pink, an ancient ape tyrant commands a frost-breathing titan, and entire civilizations exist beneath the Earth's surface. It is louder, brighter, stranger, and more openly fantastical than almost anything that came before it in the monsterverse. Yet hidden underneath all that impossible spectacle is an unexpectedly simple emotional idea. Kong is looking for a family. Jia is trying to understand where she belongs. Shimo is trapped inside someone else's idea of power. Scar King believes family exists to serve the strongest member. And Godzilla, perhaps the strangest character in the entire equation, continues to define himself through protection rather than belonging. That is why the new empire is such an interesting turning point. It is not merely another escalation of Godzilla vs. Kong. It is the moment when the monsterverse stops asking which titan should dominate the world and starts asking what these creatures do with power once domination is no longer the goal. The easiest way to misunderstand this movie is to judge it by the rules of the earlier MonsterVerse films. Godzilla in 2014 was filmed like an approaching natural disaster, something enormous and terrifying that humans could barely comprehend. Godzilla, king of the monsters, leaned harder into ancient mythology while still preserving an atmosphere of catastrophe. Godzilla vs. Kong finally embraced the spectacle audiences had been waiting for, allowing the two icons to collide in ways that previous films had only teased. But the new empire goes somewhere different. It does not seem particularly interested in convincing us that these monsters could exist in our world. It wants us to believe in their world. That distinction matters. The camera is no longer constantly trying to hide the impossible. Instead, it celebrates it. Hollow Earth becomes a fantasy kingdom. Titans become almost mythological characters. Colors become brighter. Creature personalities become more expressive. The action becomes faster and more playful. Even the most absurd ideas are presented with the confidence of a Saturday morning adventure that assumes the audience has already accepted the premise. And that is precisely where Kong enters the story. After everything he endured, Kong has technically achieved something he spent his entire life wanting. He has escaped the artificial containment of Skull Island. He has survived the battle with Godzilla. He has entered the Hollow Earth, the hidden world connected to the origins of the Titans. He has freedom. He has space. He has food. He has an entire world to explore. Yet none of that solves the problem that has followed him since the beginning. Kong is still alone. The opening image of Kong wandering through Hollow Earth is therefore more important than it first appears. The environment around him is enormous, but the character himself feels small within it. This is a familiar visual contradiction in monster cinema. The creature is physically gigantic, yet emotionally isolated. The landscape gives Kong everything except companionship. He moves through a world filled with possibilities, but there is no one beside him who truly understands what it means to be Kong. The MonsterVerse has always used size as a source of spectacle, but here size becomes a source of loneliness. The bigger the environment becomes, the clearer the absence of another member of his species feels. That is why his injuries matter as much as his exploration. Kong's body has become a record of survival. He carries damage from battles that were not simply action scenes but moments that shaped his relationship with the world. His injured arm makes his loneliness visible. There is something almost painfully human about watching him compensate for an injury rather than simply ignoring it. He is powerful enough to dominate most creatures he encounters, but power does not make pain disappear. The later mechanical solution is therefore more than a cool upgrade. It becomes another piece of visual storytelling about adaptation. Kong cannot return to the creature he once was, so he has to become something new. Meanwhile, on the surface, Godzilla has developed into a completely different kind of protagonist. He is not searching for family. He is not searching for identity. He does not need human approval. Godzilla's role has become almost instinctive: maintain balance, eliminate threats, and return to solitude when the work is done. His relationship with the world is fundamentally different from Kong's. Kong wants connection. Godzilla accepts isolation as part of his nature. This difference becomes one of the movie's quietest strengths. Kong's journey is emotional because he wants something. Godzilla's journey is functional because he knows what he is. That does not make Godzilla less important. In fact, it makes their eventual partnership more interesting. They do not become friends in a conventional sense. They become useful to each other because their strengths and purposes finally align. One represents the desire to belong. The other represents the responsibility to protect. The movie does not need to turn Godzilla into a sentimental character to make the partnership work. It simply has to give him a threat worthy of his attention. While Kong wanders through hollow earth and Godzilla maintains order above, Jia is experiencing a different kind of loneliness. Her problem is not that she has no family. It is that she has begun to question what family means. Jia has Eileen Andrews, the woman who raised and loves her, but the disappearance of the Iwi civilization has left her with a growing sense that something fundamental about her identity is missing. Her visions and connection to her heritage place her between two worlds. She belongs to the human world that raised her, but she is also connected to a civilization and history that existed before she could understand it. That makes Jia an emotional mirror of Kong. Kong is searching for members of his species because he believes finding them might finally answer the question of where he belongs. Jia is looking toward her ancestry for a similar answer. Both characters are surrounded by worlds that are technically theirs, yet neither feels completely at home within them. And the movie quietly asks a question that applies far beyond giant monsters. If you discover where you came from, does that automatically tell you who you are? The answer becomes more complicated as the story unfolds because ancestry and belonging are not necessarily the same thing. Jia's heritage matters. It gives her access to a history that was hidden from her. But heritage cannot erase the relationships that shaped her. Eileen's fear is therefore understandable. Her concern is not simply that Jia might discover another culture. It is that Jia might discover a part of herself that she cannot follow. The human storyline exists to give language to the emotional ideas that the Titans cannot speak aloud. Kong cannot explain loneliness in dialogue. Godzilla cannot sit down and discuss responsibility. Shimo cannot tell us in human words what it means to be imprisoned by another creature. Jia can. Eileen can. The human characters become interpreters for a story that is fundamentally being acted out by monsters. That function also explains why the movie sometimes seems more interested in the Titans than the humans. It is not necessarily an accident. The new empire is increasingly comfortable allowing the monsters to carry emotional weight that earlier films might have given to human protagonists. Bernie is still investigating strange phenomena with his familiar combination of enthusiasm and conspiracy-minded curiosity. Trapper enters with a deliberately exaggerated energy that fits the movie's brighter tone. Eileen remains the emotional anchor of Gia's story. But none of them is expected to compete with Kong walking through an impossible underground civilization. The film knows what audiences came to see. The challenge is not convincing viewers that giant monsters are exciting. The challenge is giving those monsters enough emotional structure that the spectacle means something. That becomes clearer when Kong finally encounters other giant apes. For a moment, the discovery seems to answer the question that has driven him through Hollow Earth. Here are creatures like him. Here is the family he has been missing. After all the isolation, the movie appears ready to give Kong the one thing he has wanted since the beginning. Then the fantasy becomes a nightmare. The apes are not living together as an equal community. They exist under the authority of Scar King. What Kong discovers is not simply another population of titans. He discovers a society organized around domination. The difference is crucial because it transforms Kong's personal search into a moral conflict. Scar King is essentially everything Kong could have become under different circumstances. Both are powerful apes. Both understand the importance of strength. Both have lived in a brutal environment. Both command the attention of other creatures. But they reach completely different conclusions about what strength is for. Kong sees power as protection. Scar King sees power as permission. That distinction defines the entire movie. Scar King does not build community. He builds hierarchy. The other apes are not companions, they are subjects. Their fear is the foundation of his authority. And the most disturbing example of that philosophy is Shimo. Shimo is introduced as an overwhelming creature whose physical abilities are almost absurd even by Monsterverse standards. Her ability to generate devastating cold makes her more than another combatant. She is an environmental force. Yet despite that power, she is not free. Scar King has found a way to use her strength for his own purposes. This creates one of the movie's most important contrasts. The most powerful creature in the room is not necessarily the one with the most control over her own life. Shimo can freeze the world, but she cannot choose where to go. Kong can lose fights, but he can choose what kind of leader he wants to become. That is the difference between strength and agency. It is also why Scar King's relationship with Shimo matters beyond the immediate villain plot. He does not understand companionship because he does not understand equality. To him, another powerful creature is either a threat or a tool. His empire depends on converting strength into obedience. Shimo's suffering exposes the cruelty underneath that system. Kong recognizes this instinctively. He does not need a speech explaining oppression. He sees a weaker creature being controlled by a stronger one, and something in him rejects it. That reaction is important because Kong's heroism in the new empire is not primarily about defeating Scar King. It is about refusing to become Scar King. This distinction makes the eventual leadership arc more satisfying. Kong does not become a king because he defeats the strongest opponent. He becomes a leader because he begins to act on behalf of creatures who cannot protect themselves. His mechanical arm reinforces that transformation. It is easy to look at the device as a blockbuster upgrade, the kind of visual addition designed to make a familiar character look new in a sequel. But the arm works better when understood as an extension of Kong's adaptation. He has been injured. He cannot simply return to the past. So he accepts assistance and becomes more capable without becoming less himself. That is another quiet idea running through the movie. Becoming stronger does not require becoming harder. Kong can receive technology without losing his animal nature. He can work with humans without becoming human. He can cooperate with Godzilla without surrendering his individuality. The character evolves by accepting connection rather than rejecting it. At the same time, Jia and the human team are moving deeper into Hollow Earth and discovering that this hidden world is not simply a larger monster habitat. It contains civilizations, symbols, memories, and stories that connect the Titans to the ancient past of humanity. The Hollow Earth becomes less like a secret geological location and more like a mythological underworld. That shift in tone is deliberate. The film's production design does not try to make Hollow Earth look like an ordinary scientific environment. Instead, it is filled with vivid colors, unusual landscapes, and exaggerated forms. The surface world often feels familiar. Hollow Earth feels imagined. This is one reason the movie's visual identity is so different from earlier MonsterVerse entries. The filmmakers are not simply expanding the geography. They are changing the genre language. Earlier films borrowed from disaster cinema, science fiction, and horror. The new empire borrows heavily from fantasy adventure. The influence of 1980s toys, cartoons, and fantasy art can be felt in the color palette and creature designs. The environments have the visual confidence of a toy box in which every character is allowed to have a distinct silhouette and color identity. Godzilla's pink evolution is perhaps the clearest example. It is not subtle. It is not realistic. It is not intended to be mistaken for naturalistic wildlife photography. It is branding, character design, mythology, and spectacle all at once. The same applies to Kong's mechanical arm, Scar King's red associated visual identity, and Shimo's icy presence. The Titans are increasingly designed like fantasy characters with recognizable visual languages. This makes the movie easier to read emotionally. Before a creature does anything, the audience already has an idea of what kind of presence it represents. That is how a colorful monster movie can communicate almost like an animated film. Yet the shift toward fantasy created a major challenge. Once a franchise becomes this exaggerated, how much realism can it afford to lose before the audience stops caring about consequences? The new empire largely answers by making emotional consequences more important than physical realism. Kong can survive impossible falls because the movie is not asking us to calculate the physics. Godzilla can evolve into a pink form because the audience is being asked to experience transformation as spectacle. Hollow Earth can contain enormous civilizations because the world functions according to mythological rules rather than strict scientific logic. The question is therefore not whether these ideas are realistic. They clearly are not. The better question is whether the movie is internally honest about the kind of fantasy it wants to be. And it is. The film's advertising essentially prepared audiences for this change. After Godzilla and Kong had already fought each other, the obvious problem was repetition. Another movie built around the same rivalry would have felt like a replay. The title itself, Godzilla x Kong, signaled the solution. The X suggested connection rather than another simple collision. Instead of asking which monster wins, the movie asks what happens when their strengths are combined. That is why the new titans matter. Scar King gives Kong an enemy who reflects his own nature. Shimo gives Godzilla a threat whose scale justifies his involvement. Hollow Earth gives the franchise a setting where the mythology can expand without constantly forcing the human world to survive another city-destroying event. The marketing also emphasized the upgrades. Pink Godzilla, Mechanical Arm Kong, new monsters, new underground civilizations. The movie's promotional identity was effectively saying that this was not the same MonsterVerse audiences had already seen. And some fans loved that. Others worried that the franchise was becoming too cartoonish. Both reactions make sense. For viewers who came to the MonsterVerse because they wanted Godzilla to feel like a terrifying force of nature, the brighter tone can feel like a departure too far. For viewers who grew up with monster toys, animated shows, creature battles and fantasy adventures, the same choices can feel like the franchise finally allowing itself to become what it always secretly wanted to be. This tension follows the movie through almost every major scene. Kong discovers his species, and the moment is simultaneously emotional and spectacular. Jia discovers an ancient civilization, and the moment is simultaneously personal and mythological. Godzilla transforms, and the moment is simultaneously narrative progression and toyetic spectacle. Scar King appears, and the movie immediately establishes him as a villain from a larger-than-life fantasy. There is no attempt to make these elements smaller than they are. That becomes especially important when Kong confronts the ape society directly. He does not simply find his people and live happily among them. He finds a community damaged by fear. The apes have adapted to oppression because survival under a tyrant has become their normal. This gives Kong a difficult problem. If he wants to belong, he could simply accept the hierarchy. He could become another powerful ape within Scar King's system. But doing so would mean accepting the very structure that has made the other apes miserable. Kong's search for family therefore reaches its first real contradiction. What if the family you find is not the family you imagined? That question connects directly to Jia's storyline. She too discovers that ancestry does not provide a simple answer. The Iwi civilization gives her a missing piece of herself, but that does not mean every emotional question disappears. Knowing where you come from can be comforting, but it can also complicate the life you already have. For Eileen, the discovery is especially difficult. She has spent years protecting Jia, and now Jia is being drawn toward a culture that Eileen cannot fully understand. The emotional conflict between them works because neither character is entirely wrong. Eileen's fear comes from love. Jia's curiosity comes from identity. One wants to protect the family they built. The other wants to understand the history that existed before that family. The film's mythology therefore mirrors its character drama. Kong discovers a society. Jia discovers a civilization. Both discoveries force them to reconsider what home actually means. Meanwhile, Godzilla is following his own path. His evolution into the pink form is one of the movie's most visually extravagant moments, but its narrative function is relatively straightforward. Godzilla is preparing for a threat greater than the ordinary titans he has been defeating. This is another example of the film's willingness to simplify. Godzilla does not need an elaborate psychological transformation. He does not need to question his identity. His development is physical because his role is mythic. He is the guardian responding to imbalance. That makes his eventual interaction with Kong almost inevitable. The two creatures began their relationship as rivals because the previous movie needed a conflict between them. But once Scar King emerges, their rivalry becomes less useful than their complementary abilities. Kong understands the ape threat from within. Godzilla possesses the raw power needed to confront the larger Titan danger. Neither can solve the problem alone. Their alliance is therefore not sentimental. It is functional. And that is exactly why it works. There is something satisfying about watching two iconic monsters stop wasting time fighting each other because the situation has finally become bigger than their rivalry. The partnership also creates a new kind of spectacle. Instead of wondering which Titan will defeat the other, the audience can enjoy the choreography of cooperation. Godzilla's power creates openings. Kong's agility and intelligence exploit them. One is built around overwhelming force. The other is built around physical improvisation. The contrast gives the action a visual rhythm that a rematch could never provide. But before that partnership becomes the emotional centerpiece, the film has to push its characters into crisis. Scar King's control over Shimo transforms him from an unpleasant tyrant into a genuine threat. Shimo's abilities are not merely useful in combat. They can alter the environment itself. The possibility that Scar King could use that power beyond Hollow Earth raises the stakes from a local rebellion to a threat affecting the surface world. This is where the movie's central theme becomes unavoidable. Power is never neutral. What matters is what someone does with it. Scar King has immense power and uses it to control. Godzilla has immense power and uses it to maintain balance. Kong gains power and increasingly uses it to protect. Shimo possesses extraordinary power but has been denied the freedom to choose how to use it. Jia possesses a connection to an ancient civilization, but her real challenge is deciding how that connection fits into the life she has already built. The characters are therefore not simply moving through a monster adventure. They are demonstrating different relationships with power, identity, and freedom. Scar King is the easiest to understand because his philosophy is deliberately simple. He wants to rule. He wants obedience. He wants other creatures to recognize him as stronger. He is not searching for community. He is constructing an empire. That simplicity has been criticized because the villain is not especially complicated. There is little mystery about what he wants. He does not have a layered political ideology or a tragic personal history that asks the audience to sympathize with him. But that may actually fit the film. The new empire operates increasingly like a fairy tale. Fairy tales often need a villain whose moral position is immediately legible. The audience should understand the difference between the tyrant and the hero without requiring a philosophical lecture. Scar King is the tyrant. Kong is the protector. The simplicity allows the movie to focus on the emotional contrast rather than spending large amounts of time explaining villain psychology. Still, there is a deeper psychological idea behind Scar King's behavior. His obsession with control suggests insecurity. A leader who genuinely trusts his community does not need to constantly prove that he is the strongest creature in the room. Scar King's authority depends on fear because he lacks the ability to inspire voluntary loyalty. Kong, by contrast, becomes stronger as a leader precisely when he stops trying to prove that he is the strongest. That is the movie's most important definition of leadership. A ruler asks, "How many will obey me?" A protector asks, "Who needs me?" Scar King counts followers. Kong notices suffering. That is why their eventual confrontation carries thematic weight even when the action itself is exaggerated. Kong's compassion toward the younger and weaker apes separates him from Scar King before the final battle ever begins. The difference is not physical. It is ethical. Kong could dominate. He chooses to protect. And that choice is what makes him heroic. The human characters reinforce this idea from another angle. Gia's growing connection to the iwi does not require her to reject Eileen. Instead, the story gradually moves toward the idea that identity can contain more than one truth. You can inherit a history without being trapped by it. You can honor ancestry without abandoning the family that raised you. This is why the word family matters so much in the movie. Family is biological for Kong in the most obvious sense. He wants to find others like him. Family is ancestral for Gia. Family is chosen for Eileen. Family is corrupted by Scar King. And family becomes something almost spiritual in the relationship between Kong and the creatures he chooses to protect. The film never presents these ideas with great philosophical complexity. It does not need to. Their simplicity is part of the movie's emotional accessibility. A teenager can understand the loneliness of wanting friends. An adult can understand the conflict between ancestry and the family they built. A child can understand that a bully uses strength to hurt weaker creatures. And a longtime monster fan can understand the pure excitement of seeing Godzilla and Kong finally fight on the same side. That combination is part of why the movie's unusual tone works for so many viewers. It is not trying to be one thing. It is a monster movie. It is fantasy. It is family adventure. It is mythology. It is comedy. It is spectacle. And occasionally, it is surprisingly sincere. The sincerity is most visible in Kong because the character communicates almost entirely through physical performance. His eyes, posture, movements and reactions do the work that dialogue would normally perform for a human protagonist. This is where the visual effects become more than technical achievement. A photorealistic Kong would not automatically be an emotionally convincing Kong. The animators need to communicate thought. When Kong pauses, the audience should feel hesitation. When he looks at another ape, the audience should understand recognition. When he reacts to pain, the audience should understand vulnerability. When he protects a weaker creature, the audience should understand compassion. These decisions exist beneath the surface of the visual spectacle. We may notice the enormous scale of a titan, but what makes the creature memorable is often something much smaller: a glance, a change in posture, the way it moves toward or away from another character. Kong's face becomes especially important because he cannot speak. His silence forces the filmmakers to trust performance rather than exposition. The same is true of Godzilla, although in a very different way. Godzilla communicates through movement and sound. His posture is heavier. His attacks carry a sense of inevitability. He does not behave like a human hero. He remains fundamentally animalistic and mythic. That restraint is valuable. The film could have made Godzilla more expressive in order to match Kong's emotional arc, but it does not need to. Godzilla's strength as a character comes from his distance. He is not a giant human in reptile form. He is something older and stranger. That makes the contrast between him and Kong more effective. Kong looks for connection. Godzilla accepts solitude. Yet both become protectors. The difference is that Kong chooses it consciously through his relationship with others, while Godzilla has almost instinctively become the guardian of balance. This also explains why the movie does not need Godzilla to become emotionally attached to the human characters in the same way Kong does. His purpose is different. If Kong is the emotional heart, Godzilla is the mythological force. Scar King is the corrupted mirror. Shimo is the enslaved power. Jia is the human bridge. Together, they form a surprisingly clean thematic structure. That structure is reinforced by color. The movie's visual palette is one of its boldest departures from earlier MonsterVerse films. Pink Godzilla immediately announces transformation. Blue and purple environments make Hollow Earth feel alien and magical. Red and orange tones associated with Scar King create an instinctive visual connection with aggression and danger. Shimo's icy appearance gives her a separate identity, one that communicates both beauty and threat. These colors are not simply decoration. They help organize the mythology. A more realistic monster film might rely on gray skies, dark cities, and naturalistic environments to make creatures feel frightening. The new empire often does the opposite. It makes the world more colorful so that the titans feel larger than life. That is why the 1980s toy influence is so important. Toys need strong silhouettes. They need recognizable colors. They need designs that can be understood immediately. The movie applies a similar logic to its creatures. You can identify Kong. You can identify Godzilla. You can identify Shimo. You can identify Scar King. Their visual identities are clear even before they begin fighting. The result resembles the logic of fantasy cartoons in which every character is designed to be instantly recognizable. Some viewers may see that as childish. But childish and childlike are not the same thing. Childish storytelling can be careless. Childlike storytelling can be imaginative. The new empire is often careless in its human dialogue, but it is rarely embarrassed by imagination. That distinction explains both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The movie's imagination is enormous. Its dramatic subtlety is not. The same applies to its mythology. Hollow Earth is fascinating because it opens a door into a world that feels almost limitless. But the more mythology the movie introduces, the more it risks making ancient history feel convenient. Legends appear when the story needs them. Connections between titans emerge rapidly. Characters discover information that conveniently explains the next stage of the conflict. From a strict narrative perspective, this can feel too easy. From the perspective of myth, however, it makes sense. Ancient myths often compress enormous periods of time into symbols and stories. They are not scientific reports. They explain why the world is the way it is. The monsterverse increasingly treats Titan history in that manner. Godzilla becomes an ancient guardian. Kong becomes the survivor and protector. Scar King becomes the tyrant. Shimo becomes the enslaved force of nature. Hollow Earth becomes the hidden realm where these archetypes intersect. The movie is not particularly interested in whether every detail could survive scientific scrutiny. It is interested in whether the mythology can support the emotional journey. That is why the ancient civilization matters. It gives Jia a physical connection to the past while also giving the audience a larger context for the Titans. Humanity has not simply discovered these creatures. Humanity has been living in the shadow of their history for far longer than anyone realized. The ancient symbols and stories therefore function like collective memory. Jia's journey becomes a process of remembering. Kong's journey becomes a process of discovering. Godzilla's journey becomes a process of maintaining. Scar King's journey becomes a process of controlling. And Shimo's existence becomes a reminder of what happens when power is stripped of freedom. That last idea is perhaps the darkest theme in the entire movie. Shimo is not evil. She is controlled. The distinction matters. Monster movies have often used giant creatures as threats because their destruction is visually exciting. But the new empire gives Shimo a more sympathetic position. She is dangerous, but danger is not the same thing as moral corruption. Her power has been weaponized. The real villain is the creature who chooses to control it. This is why freeing Shimo matters more than simply defeating her. If the heroes killed her, they would solve the immediate threat but fail the deeper moral problem. Liberation requires recognizing that Shimo is a victim of domination rather than simply another enemy. That idea completes Kong's transformation. He does not simply defeat the tyrant. He breaks the system. The distinction between those two actions is important. Defeating a ruler does not automatically free a people. Someone has to choose what comes afterward. Kong does. He frees the apes and becomes their leader not through fear but through protection. That is the film's clearest statement about power. Strength becomes meaningful when it serves someone other than yourself. This principle also explains Godzilla's role. Godzilla has enormous power, but he is not interested in ruling the creatures of the world. He does not establish an empire. He does not demand loyalty. He appears when balance is threatened and disappears when the threat is removed. In that sense, Godzilla represents power without ownership. Kong represents power becoming responsibility. Scar King represents power becoming domination. Shimo represents power without freedom. Jia represents identity without certainty. The entire movie can therefore be read as a series of different answers to one question: what do you do when you possess something greater than yourself? The answer determines who you become. The production design supports this moral structure through scale. Titans are often framed against environments that make them appear almost godlike. But the same framing can also make them vulnerable. A gigantic Kong standing alone in an enormous hollow earth landscape looks powerful and lonely at the same time. That visual contradiction is essential to his character. The camera can make Kong look like a god. His behavior reminds us that he is still a lonely animal. This is one reason the action sequences work best when they are connected to character goals. A Titan fight is impressive by itself, but it becomes memorable when the audience understands what the fight means. Kong fighting Scar King means rejecting tyranny. Godzilla fighting Shimo means confronting a threat he cannot ignore. Kong protecting the apes means choosing responsibility. The alliance between Kong and Godzilla means cooperation replacing rivalry. The film's best action therefore functions as narrative rather than interruption. That does not mean every action beat is perfectly integrated. Sometimes the movie simply wants to show off. And that is perfectly consistent with its philosophy. The New Empire is unapologetically a spectacle film. Its runtime is relatively compact, which helps maintain momentum. The story does not spend hours building a complex political system inside Hollow Earth. It moves quickly from discovery to confrontation to alliance to final battle. This pacing can feel rushed when judged by conventional dramatic standards. But it also prevents the movie from becoming bogged down in mythology. Wingard's direction understands that the franchise's primary attraction is physical spectacle. The challenge is keeping that spectacle emotionally readable. The camera needs to make the Titans feel enormous without turning every fight into visual chaos. Creature movement needs to communicate weight. Environments need to give the audience a sense of geography. The audience should understand not only that something enormous is happening, but who is doing what and why. That becomes particularly important in a film containing multiple Titans with radically different abilities. Kong is physical and agile. Godzilla is powerful and direct. Scar King is aggressive and manipulative. Shimo is elemental. Their differences create natural choreography. Kong can improvise. Godzilla can overwhelm. Shimo can alter the environment. Scar King can exploit another creature's strength. The final battles therefore feel like an extension of the characters rather than random combinations of visual effects. Visual effects are especially important because none of these creatures can simply walk onto a set and perform opposite human actors. Their emotional credibility must be created digitally. That requires attention to body language, facial expression, lighting, scale, and interaction with the environment. Kong's weight has to feel believable when he lands. Godzilla's movements have to communicate mass. Shimo's ice abilities have to affect the environment around her. Scar King's physical behavior has to distinguish him from Kong. The mechanical arm must appear integrated into Kong's movement rather than pasted onto him. These details are easy to overlook precisely because successful effects disappear into the experience. The audience does not consciously think about how Kong's feet interact with the ground. They simply believe that he has weight. That is the achievement. But the film does not always prioritize realism over expression. In fact, it often does the opposite. The Titans are exaggerated because exaggeration makes them more readable. This is the difference between realistic CGI and expressive CGI. Realistic CGI asks, could this creature exist? Expressive CGI asks, can I understand this creature? The New Empire chooses the second question. And that choice extends into the sound design. A Titan is not convincing simply because it looks large. It needs to sound large. Godzilla's roar has become one of the most recognizable sounds in monster cinema. Kong's vocalizations communicate pain, anger, warning, and emotion. Shimo needs a distinct sonic identity because her presence is not simply visual. Scar King sounds help separate him from Kong even though they belong to the same general species. Then there are the mechanical sounds. Kong's new arm has a physical identity because it moves differently from the rest of his body. The sound of machinery reinforces the sense that his body has changed. Ice cracking and collapsing gives Shimo's power a physical consequence. Titan footsteps create anticipation before the creature even enters the frame. Sound sells scale. But sound also sells emotion. A roar is not merely volume. It is communication. A low-frequency impact does not simply tell us that something hit the ground. It tells us that the world itself seems to react. Silence can be just as important. Before a major impact, the soundtrack may pull back. The absence of sound creates anticipation. When the impact arrives, the contrast makes it feel larger. This is where the score by Tom Hokenborg and Antonio Di Iorio becomes essential. The music gives the film its oversized personality. Hokenborg's return connects the new empire to the previous monsterverse while allowing the score to match the new tone. The music has to make impossible creatures feel mythic, dangerous, heroic, and sometimes even playful. That is a difficult balancing act. If the music becomes too serious, the movie's exaggerated visuals can feel unintentionally ridiculous. If it becomes too comedic, the Titans lose their sense of grandeur. The score therefore has to move between awe, danger, adventure, and triumph. Percussion creates physical momentum during action. Larger orchestral passages make the Titans feel monumental. Musical ideas associated with particular creatures help the audience understand emotional shifts even when the creatures cannot speak. Music becomes the emotional translator. When Kong is alone, the musical language can make the space around him feel emptier. When the Titans enter combat, rhythm creates momentum. When a new threat appears, the score expands the sense of danger. When the heroes cooperate, the music can transform that cooperation into something almost ceremonial. The result is that the movie feels larger than its dialogue. This is fortunate because the human dialogue is one of its weaker elements. Critics were right to question parts of the human storyline. Characters occasionally speak in ways that feel designed to deliver information rather than reveal personality. Bernie remains entertaining for viewers who enjoy his eccentric energy, but his role can sometimes feel more functional than dramatic. Trapper's exaggerated personality fits the movie's cartoon-like tone, yet that same exaggeration can make him feel disconnected from the emotional seriousness of Jia and Eileen's storyline. This tonal inconsistency is one of the film's biggest risks. The movie can move from a genuinely emotional moment involving Jia and Eileen into an intentionally absurd monster sequence without much warning. For some viewers, that flexibility is part of the fun. For others, it weakens emotional investment. The issue is not necessarily that the movie contains humor. Humor has always been part of the monsterverse. The issue is tonal hierarchy. What is the audience supposed to take seriously? The movie's answer seems to be, take the characters seriously, but do not necessarily take the world seriously. That is an important distinction. The Titans' emotions matter. The exact physics of Hollow Earth do not. Kong's loneliness matters. Whether a creature of this size could realistically move through a particular environment matters less. Jia's identity conflict matters. The ancient mythology does not need to function like a textbook. Once that rule is understood, the movie becomes easier to appreciate on its own terms. It also explains the reaction from audiences who embraced it as pure monster entertainment. The release became an event built around recognizable imagery. Pink Godzilla was instantly memorable. Kong's mechanical arm created a new visual identity for a character audiences already knew. Shimo introduced a creature with an unusual combination of beauty and destructive power. Scar King gave Kong a villain who could be understood immediately. And the prospect of Godzilla and Kong working together offered a spectacle that the previous film could not repeat. This is where the commercial logic of the movie becomes visible. These characters are not simply protagonists. They are icons. Their images can exist on posters, toys, collectibles, memes, clips, and social media thumbnails without requiring the viewer to understand the entire mythology. A pink Godzilla is instantly recognizable. A mechanical arm Kong is instantly recognizable. A giant icy titan is instantly recognizable. The film's visual clarity makes it naturally shareable. That helped create the sense that the movie was not just another sequel but an event. The reaction also revealed a generational divide. Younger viewers who are comfortable with exaggerated fantasy may see the movie as exactly what a giant monster blockbuster should be. Older viewers who remember the more serious tone of 2014's Godzilla may experience the change as a loss of identity. Neither reaction is inherently wrong. They are responding to different versions of the same franchise. The MonsterVerse has always contained multiple traditions. Godzilla himself has been portrayed as horror, disaster, allegory, hero, villain, comedy character, and family entertainment across decades. Kong has similarly evolved from tragic giant to adventure icon. So the idea that there is only one correct tone for these characters has never really been true. The new empire simply chooses one of the loudest possibilities. It chooses wonder. It chooses exaggeration. It chooses adventure. And commercially, audiences responded. The film earned roughly 568 to 572 million worldwide, depending on the reporting source and accounting conventions used for its final gross, against a production budget commonly estimated in the range of roughly 135 to 150 million. That performance made it a major commercial success and, according to later franchise reporting, the highest-grossing MonsterVerse installment. Those numbers matter because they provide an answer to the debate over tone. Whatever critics thought about the human dialogue or mythology, audiences were willing to pay to see this version of Godzilla and Kong. The theatrical presentation was part of the appeal. Giant monsters benefit from a large screen because scale is one of their defining characteristics. A titan that looks enormous on a phone becomes something else entirely when its footsteps, roars and destruction fill a cinema. The movie was built for that environment. It was designed to be experienced collectively. A crowd reacts to the first appearance of a familiar monster. People recognize the visual transformation. They anticipate the roar. They laugh at the absurdity. They cheer when the two titans finally cooperate. That is not a minor aspect of the film's identity. It is the point. A movie can be critically uneven and still succeed at creating an unforgettable theatrical experience. And the new empire understands that experience better than it understands subtle dialogue. Its commercial success also strengthens the case for the MonsterVerse as a long-term franchise. Godzilla and Kong had already proven they could exist in the same cinematic universe. Now the film demonstrated that they could become recurring partners rather than simply recurring opponents. That creates a larger storytelling opportunity. Hollow Earth can become a foundation for new mythology. New titans can introduce different visual identities. Human characters can carry stories across different parts of the world. Godzilla can remain a guardian. Kong can develop his own society. But the opportunity also creates a danger. Escalation can become meaningless. If every sequel introduces a threat larger than the previous one, eventually bigger stops being exciting. The MonsterVerse has to find ways to create emotional stakes without constantly increasing physical scale. That is where Kong's storyline provides a useful model. His most important conflict is not the size of Scar King's army. It is the question of what kind of leader he will become. The future of the franchise can benefit from that lesson. A giant monster does not need to destroy a larger city every time to create meaningful drama. Sometimes the most important conflict is between two different ideas of power. That is why Scar King, despite his simplicity, is useful. He gives the film a moral opposite for Kong. Kong's strength creates protection. Scar King's strength creates fear. The villain is not memorable because he is complicated. He is memorable because he is visually and thematically clear. The same clarity applies to Shimo. She represents a force that has been denied agency. Her liberation gives the final battle an emotional dimension that a simple hero versus monster confrontation would not have. When the control is broken, Shimo's status changes. She is no longer an instrument. She becomes herself. That transformation also completes Kong's leadership. A ruler needs weapons. A protector frees them. The final confrontation therefore works on several levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a giant monster battle. At the character level, it is Kong confronting the opposite version of himself. At the thematic level, it is liberation versus domination. At the franchise level, it is Godzilla and Kong finally functioning as a team. And at the emotional level, it is about Kong discovering that belonging does not require him to control anyone. The upgraded mechanical arm becomes part of this final evolution. Earlier, it represented adaptation to injury. Now it becomes part of Kong's ability to fight on behalf of others. The technology does not replace his strength. It extends it. Godzilla's arrival adds another layer because the partnership is now complete. The two monsters do not suddenly become sentimental friends. They simply understand that their goals overlap. Godzilla confronts the threat because balance is at stake. Kong confronts it because his people are suffering. Their motivations are different. Their destination is the same. That is enough. The final battle also demonstrates the advantages of the film's visual philosophy. In a darker, more realistic MonsterVerse movie, the choreography might emphasize destruction and physical consequences. Here, the action emphasizes movement, combinations, and visual surprise. The Titans are almost like fantasy heroes with enormous bodies. That is why the film can feel closer to an animated adventure than a disaster film. And that is not necessarily a flaw. It is a choice. The question is whether the audience accepts the choice. For many viewers, the answer was yes. For many critics, the answer was more complicated. The critical divide around the new empire is revealing because both sides were often reacting to the same qualities. Critics could admire the Titan action while criticizing the human story. Fans could acknowledge the weak dialogue while deciding that it did not matter because they had come for the monsters. That difference in priorities is important. A film can be evaluated as a piece of drama, but genre expectations matter. Nobody watches a giant monster movie expecting the same experience as a courtroom drama. At the same time, being a monster movie does not automatically excuse every storytelling weakness. The best creature films understand that spectacle and character can strengthen each other. The new empire gets there with Kong. It struggles to get there with some of the humans. That is perhaps the fairest criticism. The problem is not that the movie focuses on Titans. The problem is that when it does focus on humans, those scenes are not always as compelling. Gia's storyline is the exception because her identity conflict connects directly to the movie's central theme. Eileen's emotional concern also works because her relationship with Gia gives the mythology personal consequences. Bernie and Trapper are more divisive because their comic energy can interrupt rather than deepen the emotional rhythm. Yet their presence serves another function. They keep the movie from becoming relentlessly solemn. The new empire does not want to feel heavy. It wants to feel fun. That is why Trapper can enter a scene with an almost exaggerated adventure movie personality while the Titans are doing things that would be horrifying in another film. The movie's tonal philosophy is almost saying, enjoy the ride. And sometimes, that is exactly what blockbuster cinema is supposed to provide. The challenge comes when the film wants the audience to feel emotional weight and then immediately undercuts it with comedy. This happens often enough that the criticism is legitimate. The same is true of the exposition. Because the movie introduces ancient civilizations, Titan history, Hollow Earth mythology, Gia's heritage, Scar King's kingdom and Shimo's history, it has a lot of information to communicate in a relatively short runtime. Some of that information arrives quickly. The audience is asked to accept connections that could have been explored more gradually. This creates a strange paradox. The film's world feels enormous. Its story sometimes feels compressed. That contrast may be one reason the movie leaves viewers divided. There is clearly enough mythology for a much longer film, but the filmmakers intentionally keep the runtime moving. That choice preserves energy but sacrifices depth. It is another example of the film choosing entertainment over complexity. And perhaps that is the most useful way to judge it. Not by asking whether it is the most sophisticated MonsterVerse movie. It probably is not. Not by asking whether its human dialogue is consistently strong. It is not. Not by asking whether its mythology is perfectly explained. It is not. Instead, ask whether it succeeds at being the kind of movie it wants to be. A colorful, fast-moving, emotionally simple, giant monster fantasy adventure. On those terms, the answer is much more positive. The movie's legacy is also larger than its individual weaknesses. Godzilla and Kong have existed in popular culture for generations. Godzilla's history stretches across decades of Japanese cinema and international adaptations. Kong's history is equally embedded in the development of Hollywood monster spectacle. Their rivalry is one of the foundational matchups in giant monster cinema. The 1962 film King Kong vs. Godzilla established the basic cultural fantasy decades before the monsterverse existed. The modern franchise first treated them as separate legends. Then Godzilla vs. Kong turned their rivalry into a contemporary blockbuster event. The new empire takes the next logical step. It makes the partnership itself the spectacle. That progression matters. The characters are no longer defined only by the question of who wins. They have become coexisting icons inside a shared mythology. This reflects the broader evolution of Hollywood franchise filmmaking. Modern audiences are accustomed to interconnected universes, recurring characters, and crossovers. But the MonsterVerse adds something different because its central characters do not communicate through conventional human dialogue. The shared universe is built around visual mythology. Godzilla does not need to explain himself. Kong does not need to give a speech. Their bodies, sounds and actions become the language of the franchise. That is part of why the concept works across generations. A child can understand the basic conflict. An adult can recognize the historical significance. A longtime Godzilla fan can appreciate the character's legacy. A new viewer can simply enjoy the spectacle. That flexibility is one of the greatest strengths of monster cinema. The creatures are simple enough to recognize but large enough to carry different meanings. Godzilla can represent destruction, nature, nuclear anxiety, guardianship, or pure spectacle depending on the film. Kong can represent loneliness, exploitation, survival, humanity's relationship with nature or adventure. The new empire chooses family and responsibility. It does not need to be the final interpretation. It simply becomes another layer. The question of what will age well is therefore fascinating. Some elements are likely to remain entertaining. Godzilla will remain Godzilla. Kong will remain Kong. The Titan battles will remain visually impressive because the basic pleasure of seeing giant creatures fight is remarkably durable. Hollow Earth has the potential to remain memorable because it is one of the franchise's most imaginative concepts. The emotional simplicity may also age surprisingly well. People will continue to understand loneliness. They will continue to understand the desire for belonging. They will continue to understand the difference between protection and domination. Those themes are not tied to a specific year. Other elements may age more quickly. Some jokes are deeply connected to the comedic style of the moment. Certain dialogue already feels more functional than timeless. The visual effects, although ambitious, will eventually be judged against future technological standards. And the pop culture energy may eventually feel like a snapshot of the era. But that does not necessarily destroy the movie's value. Nostalgia can actually transform weaknesses into historical texture. A movie can become enjoyable partly because it reminds audiences of the period in which it was made. The colorful aesthetic, the exaggerated creature designs, and the toy-like upgrades may eventually become part of what makes the new empire recognizable. That is particularly true for younger audiences. The same way older generations remember particular versions of Godzilla or Kong, younger viewers may eventually remember Pink Godzilla and Mechanical Arm Kong as their version of the characters. That is how pop culture evolves. Every generation receives its own monster mythology. And that is why the movie's deliberately childlike energy should not be dismissed too quickly. There is a legitimate artistic value in allowing audiences to experience wonder without apologizing for it. Cinema does not always need to be realistic to be meaningful. Sometimes the impossible is useful precisely because it frees us from ordinary expectations. A giant ape searching for his family can express loneliness more directly than a realistic human drama. A titan controlled by another creature can express the idea of weaponized power without needing a political speech. A young woman discovering her ancestry can express the universal tension between heritage and chosen family. The monsters become metaphors because the story gives their actions emotional meaning. That is where the movie's simplicity becomes an advantage. It is easy to understand. But easy to understand does not mean empty. The film's ethical framework is surprisingly consistent. Domination is wrong. Freedom matters. Family creates responsibility. Strength should protect rather than exploit. Identity can contain both ancestry and choice. Power without empathy becomes tyranny. Those are not revolutionary ideas. They are foundational ones. And perhaps that is why the movie does not need to complicate them. A myth is often strongest when its moral architecture is clear. Scar King is the tyrant because he believes strength gives him the right to control.